Welcome back to your Verano 1711 podcast. This is your host, Marv. Today, bringing you another episode all the way from Honduras, Central America. If you have no issues locating that place in your map, no worries. We're not that big deal. Today, I am joined by two great persons here. Of course, I'm talking about Dr. Wassén, Cecilia Wassén, and Dr. Tobias Hägerland. Guys, thank you for accepting our invitation. Pleasure to have you on. How are you doing today?
Pleasure to be here with you.
Thanks a lot for having us here.
Okay. So somebody in the audience is saying good morning. So
Good morning.
thank you for being here.
Yes, it's afternoon. Good afternoon.
Yeah. So yes, as you can see, people on the thumbnail of this episode, today we're going to be talking and discussing this book, Jesus, the Apocalyptic Prophet. This book was written by both Dr. Wassén and Dr. Hägerland. And first, personally, I saw the title, and anything that has to do with apocalyptic, I'm on it. I'm hooked, just right from the get-go. So, guys, before we can go into things, please, we're gonna ask you for you to give us a little bit of your background, your credentials, who you are, and since Dr. Hägerland and I are gentlemen, we're gonna let the ladies to go first. Dr. Wassén, please, the floor is yours.
Hi. I'm a professor of New Testament studies at Uppsala University, which is a short distance from Stockholm, north of Stockholm, but it is the oldest university of Sweden and the largest. So that's where I am. I did my undergraduate there at Uppsala, but then I moved to Canada to do my doctorate at McMaster University, where I wrote a dissertation on women in the Damascus document. So one of the scrolls, or one of the documents, there are several scrolls from the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran. And then I've continued working on the Dead Sea Scrolls and also on the New Testament, different aspects, and particularly apocalyptic thought is very interesting, I find.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that.
Apocalyptic thought is very interesting. I'm sorry, I can't hear anything.
You lost the sound.
I'm sorry, I can't hear anything.
Yeah.
Lost the sound.
Yeah. Be just a moment here.
Yeah.
See. Yeah. Okay, let's see now. Okay, what about now?
And that sounds
Can you
better.
hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. My computer, some demon entered and took over it. So, okay, thank you for that intro, Dr. Wassén. Now let's go with you, Dr. Hägerland. You get the floor now.
Yeah, thank you. I'm an associate professor of New Testament studies at the University of Gothenburg. It's on Sweden's west coast, and it's not a very ancient university. It was actually founded only in the 20th century, but it's a thriving and quite big university nowadays. I did my undergraduate studies and also my doctorate in Gothenburg, and having finished my dissertation, which was on the historical Jesus and the forgiveness of sins, I transferred to Lund University, another prestigious university in Sweden, and I worked there for quite a few years, for 8 years, until 2017, when I picked up this position, a teaching position at the University of Gothenburg. So I'm quite happy to be back here. And while we did the real work with our book, I was still at Lund. I'm now happy to be working together with Cecilia in quite a huge research project, a research program involving more than 20 scholars in Sweden on the topic of criticism, coming from different subjects and backgrounds, and it's a very fruitful collaboration that we continue to have.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, with that in mind, what would you say if we could go and get into the questions that we have prepared here for you? So the first question will be popping up on your screen. There you go. So first things first, in the intro of your book, you write about the Jesus of faith and the historical Jesus. So can you please elaborate on the reasons, okay, so that's there, for beginning in that way your book?
Yes, I think we can. I mean, when you write a book about Jesus, and Cecilia and I can also give some background on that. We discovered a few years ago that we had been thinking more or less about the same thing. Writing a book, it started out as a popular level book in Swedish about the historical Jesus, because both of us had been working on the historical Jesus academically. And we had the impression that the man or the woman in the street, so to speak, was not really up to date with academic research on the historical Jesus. Very few people in, let's say, the Western world don't know anything about Jesus. And I suppose you can say that most people have some opinion, some image of Jesus, but it's usually not the historical Jesus. It's usually Jesus as mediated through the Christian faith. And so it's almost natural that when you start writing a book that is aimed not only at the expert level of scholars, you have to clarify that what we are trying to do in this book is not to give a religious portrait of Jesus. We are not trying to summarize the Christian faith. We are not in any way competing with that either, to be sure. But it's a huge difference, of course, if you want to approach Jesus as a person in the past, in the historical past, with all the historical methods available, and from a very, let's say, thorough historical critical perspective, as opposed to presenting a picture of Jesus that is, of course, taking into consideration the same sources that we are working with, the New Testament Gospels primarily, but also, of course, taking into account 2,000 years of Christian development of doctrine, councils, and so on, and also every believer's personal experience of having a connection to Jesus. So there are two different things, and we thought it was very important to make that clear from the beginning.
When you say 2,000 years, that's quite a while.
Yeah.
A lot of things that happen. Now, Dr. Wassén, please go ahead and give us your answer to this question.
No, I just wanted to add that we really making an effort to try to situate Jesus in his historical context, which is a Jewish context. And it's a challenge for readers, I think, of the Gospels to go back to try to forget about 2,000 years of Christian history and Christian portrayals of Jesus. So we're also trying to, well, we hope that the book functions a bit as an introduction to early Judaism. So that's where we begin.
Let's move on to the second question. Again, we want to value and respect your time. Again, thank you for being here. So the second question goes like this. Moving on to chapter 1, which has to do with Jesus' birth in the life in Galilee. In broad strokes, what's the line of argument laid out in there?
Well, first, we argue that Jesus wasn't born contrary to the infancy stories, the birth narratives, that he wasn't born in Bethlehem, but in Nazareth. So we like the majority of scholars hold that it was the invention of the early church to place Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. It's more logical to assume that he was born in Nazareth, where he was from. And if you compare the two birth narratives in Matthew and in Luke, they disagree on everything except for that Mary was a virgin and that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. But why was he in Bethlehem? They differ, and so on. So we think that's a later development. So being born in Nazareth, small village in Galilee, and we know that he was the oldest of several siblings. We have the names of his brothers, and we also know that he had sisters.
Yeah.
So a large family. And he's called the tekton, the handyman, carpenter, at one point, and the son of a carpenter. So it appears that he worked as a handyman, perhaps building in the building industry, perhaps with his brothers and his father. And what's interesting with Nazareth is that it's quite close to Sepphoris, a larger, a town about 5 kilometers from Nazareth that was being rebuilt at this time. So there would have been work opportunities there. So perhaps he worked there with his brothers and father. We don't know much about his upbringing, but we just get some clues. We also know that he must have been illiterate, fairly illiterate.
I didn't know that. Okay, I didn't know that. Dr. Hägerland, what you got to say about this question?
Yeah, I think what Cecilia just mentioned, those few facts about Jesus' background, that he was from Nazareth and he was a tekton, whatever that is, a carpenter or builder or something, and that he had siblings and so on. That's more or less what we find in the Gospel of Mark, because as many viewers probably already know, the Gospel of Mark starts with Jesus as a grown-up person, doesn't say anything about Jesus' childhood. And I think we must imagine that when the people responsible for the Gospels of Matthew and Luke started to compose their Gospels, they wanted to add a kind of prequel to what they already found in the Gospel of Mark. So they wanted to say something about Jesus' birth and upbringing and childhood. And it seems that more or less what they did was working backwards from what they knew about Jesus as an adult, and then combining this with the idea that Scripture was being fulfilled in the life of Jesus. So we have to recognize that the birth narratives, as we usually call them in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, are of a quite different genre, you could say. It's another type of narrative than the main part of the Gospels, very steeped into this idea that Scripture is being fulfilled, very much orient towards, especially the Gospel of Matthew, refers back all the time to the Scriptures being fulfilled. So it's not, I mean, the Gospels, and we may come back to this, the Gospels as a whole are, of course, not the best material for historical reconstruction, but the birth narratives are especially difficult to use to extract history from. So we need to keep that in mind when we read them as historians.
And that's the thing, because the other day I was listening to a scholar, is a historical Jesus scholar, and he said, when it comes to history is messy. It's complicated. You have to go there, and it's a lot of complexities, and the figure of Jesus is no exception. So moving on, Dr. Wassén, you were about to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, and if you also think about the timeline, If the
Oh,
first
yeah.
gospel was
Chronology.
written down around the 70, Mark's gospel, then it's quite a long time after Jesus was born. So
Hmm.
these are the oldest, supposedly, memories.
Hmm. Yeah.
And he was probably born just before our common era. So that's about 70 years earlier.
Ooh.
And it makes sense to assume that as his followers after his death believed that he was somehow divine, they would also start thinking about wondering, well, what would his birth have been like? And they knew about Greek and Roman myths, about these legends about great men having great births, something spectacular. So it's sort of logical to assume that those kind of legends developed a bit later.
You know, my mentor, I don't know if you knew him, the late Michael Heiser, he was a Semitist. He used, you know, he was not fond of the traditional date, which is, as Dr. Wassén says, 4th BCE. He was citing a couple of articles. Those names escape me now, but he was arguing with them different date, which is it's century 2, yeah, BCE. And he was running agreeing the consensus, because I understand that's the consensus.
Yep.
So
Well, it's based on the date of Herod the Great.
Yeah.
yes,
Because the Gospels agree
that's right.
that he was born under.
Yeah, and there is some discussion on exactly when Herod the Great died. So that also affects the timeline of Jesus, but most would say 4 BCE. But that's an interesting point of convergence as well between Matthew and Luke, that they both place the birth of Jesus under Herod the Great. And even the Gospel of John, for all its reworkings of the earlier Gospels, seems to place to date the birth of Jesus in the time of Herod the Great. So that seems quite to be a very strong early tradition there, actually. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Let's move on here with the third question. We're doing pretty good with the time. So, in terms of historical reconstruction, why is it, and this is the question that Dr. Wassén asked me to reformulate, and I agree with her, but why is it so important to understand Judaism as it was in the time of Jesus?
Well, because
Dr. Wassén.
yeah, because Jesus was Jewish and lived in a Jewish society. So the more we understand of the culture and religion of his time, the better chance we have to understand his mission and his teaching. And one of the principles that we followed in order to reconstruct the historical Jesus is that nothing that sort of is far off from Judaism in the time of Jesus could derive from Jesus. We don't think that he acted as anyone else than a Jewish teacher.
Yeah. Dr. Hägerland.
Yeah, if I can follow up on that, and we may come back to the more precise criteria that we use for establishing.
Yeah,
it seems to go back to the historical Jesus in the Gospels, but it's quite amazing that it used to be the case in historical Jesus research that many scholars thought that it's precisely when Jesus seems to be saying or doing something that goes against what we know about ancient Judaism that we find the authentic historical Jesus. And that's quite crazy, actually. And I don't know any historical Jesus scholar today that would subscribe to that idea, because that's very much rooted in the idea that Jesus, the main purpose of Jesus' mission was somehow to revolt against or to supersede Judaism,
Mm.
and that's not where we are today at all.
Yeah.
So that has changed quite dramatically. At the same time, it is a little tricky methodologically, because we say on the one hand that whatever we say about Jesus has to fit within Judaism, the Judaism of his day, since he was a Jew, and we can all agree on that. On the other hand, the Judaism of Jesus' day was so manifold and took so many expressions that it's very difficult to say what really falls outside of Judaism. For example, there has been the suggestion that what Jesus says at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, he tells his disciples to go out and to baptize all the nations in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit. The case has been made that this is plausible within early first century Judaism. I'm not really sure about that, but where is the limit? And our source material for first century Judaism is, of course, also very limited. We know about these large groups like the Pharisees and a few things about Sadducees, and probably quite a lot about the Essenes. But then there are these groups that just pop up in one of the sources, and just it makes us realize that probably there were several other groups and sects within Judaism that we have lost track of them. So it's a little tricky.
Yeah, no,
Dr. Wassén, any further comments?
Important comment that it's easy to say that yes, Jesus needs to fit within the Judaism of his time, but it's a different thing to reconstruct the Judaism of his time, because scholars have very different views of what Judaism looked like as well. But there are some basics I think that most scholars would agree on when it comes to Jewish culture at Jesus' time, is that the temple was extremely important. There was only one temple. So the sacrificial cult was central for the Jewish religion. What religion is sort of a modern word, but anyway, you know what I mean. And which is very different then from later times, because the temple was destroyed in 70 and was never rebuilt. But also for the Jews in the diaspora. And at this time, there were more Jews living outside of Palestine, Israel, than in the land. But even for them, it was important with the one temple in Jerusalem, and they all tried to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So this is, to begin with, very different from later forms of Judaism. And we should also remember that the sacrificial worship was the common way of having a relationship with your god or gods. So that was central. And also, I think scriptures, the Torah was central. But we shouldn't assume that people studied. It's a sort of, even many scholars just assume that all people will go to the synagogue and study and listen to the Torah. But I think that's anachronistic, because it's very few people were literate. So I think they would be listening to these traditions, and in various forms. You would hear these stories, you would retell them and listen to new versions. So it's much more of an oral milieu than we are used to in modern times. People didn't know how to read, and very few could write. That's why we have scribes. It was a special handicraft. But the priest, and we should remember the priests, and they sort of, their importance disappeared with the destruction of the temple. They would have been the intellectual ones who were able to read, and many of some of the members, and probably some of the leading members in these different parties, would have been priests and would have been educated. And what's interesting with Jesus is that he doesn't seem to have been educated, but he acts as if he knows the scripture, knows how to interpret these traditions against these educated elite. So he made enemies for sure. Like if I have new students who think they know the New Testament and historical Jesus better than I do, then I get a bit upset. So,
okay, I'm gonna add this to the final clip.
The last, I think, of the important, if you look at the central
sure, go ahead.
parts of Judaism at this time, scripture, the temple, and the one God, the Israelite God.
Oh yeah, big deal.
But we should remember that God was never alone in the heaven. There were always an entourage of angels, and some of these angels, in the time of Jesus, they had grown into very important roles, and they sort of look a little bit like minor divinities, minor gods, but they are normally not called gods, but
he's not alone. There's somebody there. Somebody, there's a bunch of guys up there with him. Dr. Hägerland, any further comments to that last comment, Dr. Wassén? I mean, we're talking about monotheism, you know.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to add to what Cecilia said about illiteracy being quite. I mean, the default, and I think this is. We were a little taken aback by the reaction because before we published this book in English, it was published in a Swedish version.
Yes.
And one of the things that many people seem to react quite strongly to was precisely this idea that maybe Jesus himself didn't know how to read and to write. And I think it's so much part of our culture today that what gives you... What makes you, I mean, if you want to lay a claim to being an expert or an authority, of course you have to know how to read and write. And that was not necessarily the case in this context. And I think it's quite telling that Jesus, quite a few times in the Gospels, when he attacks the elite, the scribes and Pharisees and high priests and so on, he starts with this rhetorical question: haven't you read that? And so he cites some scripture, but when he talks to the people, he never says, have you read, or have you read in the scriptures? It's always, you have heard this. So that's quite probably for Jesus too. It was more an issue of hearing the contents of what became the scriptures than reading it with your own eyes.
Thank you. Let's move on here. So now we are in the fourth question. So let's focus on Jesus of the Gospels, the Jesus and the Jesus of history. Why is it necessary to even make such a distinction right from the get-go?
Yeah, this brings us back, I think, to the first question that you asked, which was actually about the distinction between the Jesus of faith and the Jesus of history. So we can say that by eliminating these 2,000 years of Christian doctrinal development, in one way we get back to the first impressions that people got from Jesus by reading the Gospels. But as historians, that's not enough. I mean, returning to the early sources is never enough. You have also to scrutinize these sources, applying solid historical methods to them. And it's quite obvious that, sometimes you hear people say, I think the Jesus of the Gospels is the historical Jesus. That can't be the case.
I've heard that.
That's never the case with any person of history, that the sources about this person is the same as the person himself or herself. Also, the Gospels are narratives. They are very clearly structured in a dramatic fashion. Even if you go back to what we think, and most scholars think, is the earliest complete Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, It
Mhm.
begins with the declaration that this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. So it's a very clear declaration on the part of the author or the narrator that who Jesus is. It's not at all a disinterested or distanced view of Jesus. And we shouldn't expect it to be, of course, because our present day idea of historicity and how to evaluate sources historically, it's very recent. So it's not at all strange that these sources are very biased, so to speak. And then, of course, if you start comparing the individual gospels, they contradict one another. We have
Yeah.
already mentioned the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke, and we can take a look at comparing, for example, the passion narratives, the narratives about Jesus' death in Mark and John. I think it's all about impossible to harmonize the dating of Jesus' death in these sources. So you have to take. I mean, if you are a serious historian, you need to decide: is one of these sources correct, and if so, which one? Or maybe both are wrong. But there are clearly places where it's impossible to hold that both sources give an accurate picture.
Thank you. Dr. Wassén?
Yeah. And if you compare the general characteristic of Jesus, he comes across as a very different person. If you take the different gospels, and particularly if you compare Mark and Mark, Matthew, Luke, I should say, they are very similar, the synoptic gospels, to John, where it's very different. But if you compare Mark, Jesus is a sort of a mysterious person. He's very secretive about his identity. And he doesn't want people to know who he is, and he doesn't want to explain, and he wants people that he has healed not to tell. He's sort of keeping this a bit secret, and it's secret. The secrecy theme runs through the gospel all the way to the end, when the women coming out from the grave, having seen the empty tomb, they are told to go out and tell the disciples about what's happened. But that's the first time. But whereas in John, he's very open with his identity. He explains in a series of sermons that he is the Son of God, and the way to the Father goes through him, belief in him. So you can't, he can't both have been very secretive and very open about his identity. It just doesn't work that way. So as scholars, we really have to look for the clues to try to get behind the texts and come up with the most probable reconstruction of his key message and work from there.
Yeah.
When it comes to, and this is part of the motto of this podcast, is that, talking about religious is a serious and important thing. I mean, for me, religion is very important, and it's a serious subject matter. And by that, I don't mean that because I'm not a sensationalist or fundamentalist. Maybe it's because I'm revolving around this world of you scholars, but I'm very open on that. And the thing is that bringing the religion and everything, it has to be scrutinized and studied critically. And that covers also the Bible, including the New Testament, and by extension, the Gospels. So when I first heard, I remember, the famous Bud Ehrman arguing about contradictions, that didn't affect me. But I know indeed there are people out there who are deeply affected if they go and listen that kind of a statement. It's like a shock, and they are stunned because in some way I understand their piety and everything, but you need to be open to this kind of discussion, because it is the evidence, and you have to follow the evidence whatever it leads. Yeah,
that's true. And I mean, for sure there are scholars who are much more skeptical than the two of us are towards the question of the historical Jesus. I mean, there are many scholars who think
I know some.
Then they may think it's completely impossible to reconstruct the historical Jesus because the sources are so biased. We think there are ways to get at the historical Jesus, and not least because there are quite a few places where you would expect the sources to be more, how should I put this, to paint Jesus in a more favorable light than they do. There are quite a few places where it comes through that Jesus, for example, fails to do a few things that you wouldn't expect him to fail about. I mean, you could point, for example, to the prime example is that he dies. That's kind of failure.
Yeah.
But there are also, smaller, lesser failures along the road. For example, in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus comes back to Nazareth, visits his hometown and meets people there who do not believe in him. The evangelist says very clearly that Jesus was unable to perform any miracles. That seems to be a mistake or failure on Jesus' part. So that goes against the grain, so to speak. And there are quite a number of places there. For example, we can see that the earliest Christian authors, such as Paul, struggled a lot with a few things about Jesus. For example, Jesus seems to have been very radical. He took a very radical position on divorce and remarriage, it seems, in the Gospels. And Paul, and you can also maybe the author of the Gospel of Matthew, they seem to struggle a bit with this because it was so radical. They didn't know how to handle it in practice.
Yeah.
So it's quite difficult to think that this is something that the first generation of Christ believers made up themselves because it caused problems for them. So there is a way, we think, to get at the historical Jesus.
Thank you. Dr. Wassén, any comments there?
Another one of those episodes that paints Jesus in a bit of a negative light is when his own family, when he comes back to Nazareth, his own family are getting worried about him and wants to take care of him because they think he's gone a bit insane.
Yeah.
Why would they make up a story like that? Well, probably not. So that says something about his background, that this was something of a development in his life that they didn't expect, and that's not what he was trained for. Which again points to a very much more humble background, perhaps as a carpenter or some kind.
Thank you. Okay, guys, we're gonna take a very quick break, and we're gonna have a word from the Enoch seminar. I know Dr. Wassén has been part of some sessions. I'm not sure, Dr. Hägerland, if you have been in the Enoch seminar. I hope you one day be there. So let's take a look at our here from them very quick. Let's see. Okay, so Dr. Wassén, did you manage to see yourself there? You were there.
Yeah.
So yeah, as I was Dr. Hägerland, I was before off camera. I was just saying, Dr. Wassén, that the main purpose of this interview is to bring the whole scholarship from different points in the globe into the Spanish speaking person, because there's a lot of people out there in the Spanish speaking world who have a keen interest in this kind of material, but the language English is a barrier. So we want to contribute by translating and make it accessible to those people. And this is an initiative from the Enoch seminar. Actually, they had the first, I think it was the first conference, virtual conference, including Spanish speaking scholars from different points, because they saw that there is a void where a lot of Spanish speaking scholars, they have been reading, they have been putting their scholarship out there, but it's not gaining a lot of traction and a lot of press. So we want to fill to some degree that void, and that's why we're doing this. And again, thank you for being here and helping to contributing to make it that happen. And as we continue, we want to expand more and more and more, and you are contributing to that definitely. Okay. So let's continue with the questions here. I need to say something. This is an anecdote that I have from Professor Gabriele Boccacini. I'm not going to name the other scholars' names. I'm not going to spill the beans here. But he was in a session with four, it was four people, him included. And they were discussing the historicity, Gospels being reliable, the historical Jesus and whatnot. And there was one New Testament scholar that he was arguing like very passionate about the non-existent. He would go and say, if the historical Jesus ever existed, we lost him. And the Gospels are not helping at all. And I remember Professor Boccacini standing up and bumping on the table like, okay, I am a historian of the Second Temple Judaism, and Jesus was a Jew of the Second Temple Judaism. And the guy was like, oh my God, the whole world's coming out. But I love the way Professor Boccacini tackled the subject matter head on, because I can say this New Testament scholar, he's now an atheist. And no, he's not the guy you're thinking, probably. It's another guy. And he is very on the margin. He's a great scholar. I gotta admit it. He holds 2 PhDs, but he's like, okay, if the historical Jesus ever existed, we lost him. There's no way to get back to him, and the Gospels cannot help us at all. And Boccacini was like, oh no, that's not the case, trust me. But it was a very intense debate. Like, you don't get to see very often those scholarly debates in a very passionate way. But that was the first time that I ran into Professor Boccacini, who happens to be the founder and director of the Enoch seminar. Just so you know, there. That's a bit of an anecdote there. So let's move on here. Sorry, you were about to say something.
Yeah, if we don't know anything about the historical Jesus, then we don't know anything about a lot of people, because we have quite a lot of sources about Jesus, comparatively speaking, from this time period. And as we say in our book, that if you made up a person like Jesus as a savior, you would have created a better ending, a happy ending. He would have been
perfect ending.
He would have been successful in clearing out the Romans. He wouldn't have ended up on the cross.
There's another guy. Again, I'm not naming any names, but this guy argues that the only way to be like 100% sure that Jesus is a historical figure is that we have some sort of like an inscription on a stone or something like that, just like
we have an inscription of Pontius Pilate.
Yeah.
Not on Jesus.
But that's the thing. Okay, let's move on here. And then, okay, now we get to talk. This guy. In your view, what kind of role does the John the Baptist play in the main and overall argument of the book?
Well, John the Baptist is very important.
Okay.
Now, the Gospels present him as a forerunner of Jesus, that he's there to prepare the people for the arrival of the Messiah. But if you look at his teaching, what we get a bit of his sermon in Matthew and Luke, and then he's preparing the people for a judge, for a coming judge and the final judgment. And Jesus doesn't fit the image of a cosmic judge that well, really. So we think a more likely reconstruction of John, on the historical John the Baptist, is that he was, because he's also presented as Elijah, who, according to Malachi, would come to prepare the people before the day of the Lord. So it is quite likely that he saw himself as Elijah, preparing the people for the final judgment, and the judge being God, who would establish his reign on earth. And he was a well-known preacher. So Josephus, the first century historian, he writes more about John the Baptist than about Jesus. And we know that people got really mad when Herod Antipas had John arrested and then executed.
Yeah.
So he was popular, and people came to listen to his sermons and to be baptized. And whereas the Gospels present him as, well, the interaction with Jesus, and John as if Jesus came there, got baptized, and then moved on, sort of started his own career and his own ministry. When we look at the Gospel of John, interestingly enough, we get a different impression, because there Jesus seemed to be hanging around a bit longer. And we also find out that John had disciples and so on. And the Gospels agree that Jesus didn't start his ministry until John had been arrested. So it is quite likely that Jesus was one of those disciples, and that he stayed with John for a longer period of time. And perhaps that's where he learned about the coming kingdom. And if you look at John's sermon in Matthew and Luke, he's preparing the people for the coming of the kingdom. And then Jesus continues to deliver that message in a different way. He doesn't baptize people, but he preaches about the kingdom and how to prepare for it. So we assume that Jesus was his disciple and that John the Baptist was his mentor.
Thank you. Dr. Hägerland.
Yeah, it may even be the case that for some period at least, Jesus did baptize, because he says in the Gospel that Jesus was baptizing. but then it's as if the evangelist has to correct himself, saying, no, of course, I don't mean Jesus was baptizing. It was his disciples. But that seems to be adjusting the story to the more well-known narrative that had already formed within the early Christian movement. So maybe Jesus was much closer to John the Baptist than any of our sources really want to admit. And I think also, as Cecilia mentioned, comparing what Josephus has to say about John the Baptist and what the Gospels say about John the Baptist is a very useful exercise in historical critical thinking and historical source criticism, because it's actually not that either of these sources give a full and convincing picture of John the Baptist. Josephus does not mention that John the Baptist's preaching had anything to do with a coming kingdom or any apocalypticism at all. John just seems to be a teacher of ethics and a reformer. And it's much more likely, actually, that the Gospels are correct in portraying John the Baptist as an apocalyptic preacher. On the other hand, the Gospels do not provide a convincing explanation for the execution of John the Baptist. There is this story about Herod having his Antipas having his birthday party and the stepdaughter dancing and so on, and it's a very fairy tale type of scene. And I think there, in that regard, Josephus is much more realistic, saying that it was for political reasons. It was because Antipas was fearing that John the Baptist was an instigator of a mass movement, threatening his political power. That's why he executed him. So this is an interesting case where you have to put the sources together, and by putting them together, you will get the best historical reconstruction of who he really was.
It's a very interesting exercise to compare the portrayals and the stories about Jesus' baptism between the Gospels, because it's in Mark he's baptized very quickly and we don't get many details, but in Matthew there is an added dialogue, and of course Matthew is using Mark. There's an added dialogue between Jesus and John where John thinks that he should be the one to be baptized, not to baptize Jesus. And Jesus has to convince him to, yes, this is according to God's plan. Go ahead.
Look at that.
And you can sense that there's something going on in Matthew's time. And since John had disciples and the movement, likely continued, there would have been some kind of competition. That's what we can speculate about between the disciples of Jesus, the followers of Jesus, and the followers of John the Baptist. Who was the greatest, really? Who was it? And then when you look at the Gospel of John, then the youngest of the Gospels, then the actual baptism isn't mentioned.
Oh, look at that.
But we all think, when we read it, we have the image of Jesus being baptized, but the dove is there, the Holy Spirit, but not.
I put the picture over there.
Being baptized. So there was they were a bit uncomfortable about Jesus being the one being baptized and not baptizing the other way around. So.
Yeah, I remember a scholar, I think Alan Street, I think is his name. He was arguing, he was making the case that the dove and coming down from heaven and everything, that was a polemic against Roman, the bird. I think it's I don't know what's the name of that bird, but this symbol, avian symbol of the Roman Empire, and that is found in some stories, narratives about the emperors before getting to the throne. And he was arguing that the author is portraying Jesus as the true Son of God. And this reminds me about this book of Michael Pepper about the Son of God in the political context, because there is a political side. You can tell me about this, you two guys. There is a political side on this phrase, the Son of God, right? The emperors, they were called that way. And so he was making that case that instead of the typical Roman symbol, the author is reversing, it's polemicizing against the empire. And no, it's not going to be that bird. It's going to be a dove. But as you know, there's a lot of interpretations. Have you read that?
Can I just comment on that? I mean, for sure, I think the motif of, let's say, anti-imperial or anti-Roman resistance is present in the Gospels. I think there are a few quite interesting passages in the Gospel of Mark, for example. You have the episode about the Gerasene demoniac legion, those many evil spirits that are chased into a herd of swine, who then drown very dramatically, and that episode seems to be filled to the brim with allusions to the Roman Empire and to Roman military forces. So there is for sure that kind of a strand within the Gospels. The question is, of course, how much of that goes back to the historical Jesus. And I find it a little. What we see of Jesus in the Gospels is quite distanced from the businesses of Rome and the emperor. I mean, we have this very famous episode also when Jesus is asked about paying taxes to Caesar and his coin and so on. But that's one of the very few times that Jesus seems to be at all commenting on the Roman emperor. He seems to be much more concerned with the local politics, much more in trouble with Antipas and the local rulers, and then in Jerusalem with the Sanhedrin and so on. So maybe Rome was felt by a person like Jesus to be a little too distant, a little too far away to be really relevant. It's difficult to know, but I think the theme is much more underlined by the evangelists who were more cosmopolitan than Jesus.
Yeah. Any further comments, Dr. Wassén?
I also think that his key message about the coming of the kingdom of God, even though he didn't perhaps he didn't mean it as an anti-Roman, anti-imperial message, but it would have been understood that way because it meant that the present reign of the Romans, the Roman Empire, was not the kingdom of God. So it was a very dangerous message.
Yeah, and he was executed for that as an insurrectionist against the Roman Empire. So for sure, that's the way it was interpreted. Yeah.
Thank you, guys. Let's move on here. We want to value your time as well. We're almost coming to a conclusion here. Now, I think it's the time of this very special. I'm very fond of this question because it has to do with Satan. Don't get me wrong. So the invasion of God and by extension his kingdom, as well as cosmic powers opposing it, including Satan, are part of the apocalyptic discourse. But how does all this square with the figure of Jesus, at least from the data at our disposal?
Well, I think this has been a debate in historical Jesus research, whether or not we should think of Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet. And it's quite clear from the title of our book that we think that's a very good label.
Yeah, it is.
But to some extent, maybe the debate has been obscured by different interpretations of apocalypticism or different ideas of what apocalypticism and eschatology mean. I mean, it's quite clear that Jesus was not really expecting the end of the world in an absolute sense. I mean, he had an idea about a perfect world. He wasn't expecting, everything that we know, the physical world, for example, to cease to exist. He was not expecting the earth to pass away and to be replaced by a holy spiritual heaven or something like that. But he was for sure expecting this decisive intervention by God into the world. So that's part of what we think of as eschatology. It's the end of the present order of things, but it's not the end of the physical world, for example. That's basic, So,
Dr. Wassén?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, Cecilia, please.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, we use apocalypse in common language as the end of the world, like apocalyptic environmental disaster and so on. But in the Jewish view, it was an optimistic view of the future where God will reign. He would establish his kingdom, his reign. So it will be a better place. And that's very much part of the apocalyptic thinking that the Christians take over. So also in the book of Revelation, for example, there will be a new Jerusalem. The heavenly Jerusalem will be established, and something new and something fantastic. And the key is that the evil forces will be destroyed. So that's also very positive. And we see that in many of the documents from the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, that finally the evil forces will be conquered. And it will be a struggle. And Jesus is also warning his followers about hard times ahead. He talks about birth pangs, that it will be very difficult. There will be suffering. There will be wars. But if you're firm and if you're righteous, that's the general view, then you will survive somehow and take part of that new era, the new time period in a better world.
Yeah.
And it seems that Jesus, at least the way he acted, was that this is already beginning to take place, because it's one of the most certain things that we know about Jesus is that he was an exorcist. That belongs to the very earliest strand of the tradition in the Gospels, that he exorcised people and acted as if he was driving out demons of people. Also his healings, the healing experience that people had in connection with Jesus were connected with this inbreaking of the kingdom of God and struggle against Satan. So this was very fundamental to Jesus' message, you could say. Then it's interesting to see that already in the Gospel of John, the exorcisms are gone. There is not a single exorcism in the Gospel of John. Maybe it was thought of as being as too brutal or too tied up with in the Gospel of John, Jesus is semi-divine all the time and not as tied to the body. So maybe John thought of it as less than worthy for a person like Jesus. But in the Synoptic Gospels, the exorcisms are all over the place. So it must have been a key factor in the reputation of the historical Jesus.
Because suffering, physical suffering, ailments of various kinds, of course, were rampant. Yeah. So he had a reputation of being a good healer and exorcist, because those two go hand in hand. And people would come to him for sure. And if I may say something on the healing on the Sabbath.
Oh, don't mess with the Sabbath. Don't mess with us.
He's criticized for doing healing on the
heavily
Sabbath.
criticized.
So
Yeah.
that also points to that, yes, he actually worked as an exorcist.
Do you think it's a sorry, go ahead, Dr. Wassén.
Was important because he's criticized from certain parts. And those that come across most clearly in the Gospels are the Pharisees, but he's criticized for doing this kind of healing as work on the Sabbath. But here is the gray zone, because everybody agreed that we shouldn't be working on the Sabbath, including Jesus. But healing was sort of a gray zone because the Jews who he was healing, well, they came to him on the Sabbath as well. So there were very different views on what constituted work on the Sabbath. And so Jesus had his views, and he didn't say, I don't care about the Sabbath. He said, well, this is what you do on the Sabbath as well. Now, he wouldn't be plowing a field on the Sabbath or building a house, but he could help people. And others did too. So this was one of those areas where there were a lot of debates.
Do you think it's a coincidence, as Dr. Hägerland was saying? Is it a coincidence that there's no exorcisms in the Gospel of John? Is that intentional? I mean, how what were you thinking? He's just going to just leave out the whole bunch of exorcisms that Jesus did, and not putting your account of Jesus? Is that intentional on the part of the author? There's something going on there. Maybe, perhaps I'm doing over too much on that.
He's certainly doing miracles, but not exorcisms.
Yeah.
I think the reason is that let's call him John the Evangelist. I think the reason is that he thought exorcisms to be they look like a partial fulfillment of the victory over Satan. And he was not happy about that. Jesus, the Son of God, fighting all these, small demons and very low on the scale. Jesus needs a worthy opponent, and that's only Satan himself. So you have Jesus saying in the Gospel of John, right before the Last Supper and the Passion narrative, now it's time to expel the ruler of this world. So there is one huge expulsion, one huge exorcism, you could say, in the Gospel of John, and that's of Mr. Satan himself. So I think that's the reason why John didn't like this idea of Jesus interacting with all these, smaller demons, but lifting it up to a higher cosmic level. That's probably the reason.
Gotcha. Okay, let's move on. Oh, there's another coming here. So my friend Martin says, not only are exorcisms not mentioned, but if I'm not mistaken, Gospel of John only registers 7 or 8 miracles in the entire narrative. Yeah, it's just like Dr. Wassén was saying. He's doing miracles in there. Maybe not exorcism, but he's doing something. He's doing something. He's working.
He is. And in the Gospel of John, they are not called only miracles, but they are called signs. So they have a completely different function than in the 3 synoptic Gospels, where in the synoptic Gospels, Jesus says explicitly that a miracle, I'm paraphrasing, but he is asked to do miracles in order for people to believe. And he's refuting that idea, saying that's impossible. You can't make people believe by making miracles. But in the Gospel of John, he is actually performing these signs in order for people to believe in him. So it's the other way around, and they seem in the Gospel of John to be very carefully selected. They always have some kind of theological import or message. There is usually a discourse of Jesus elaborating on, for example, when he heals in the Gospel of John this man who was blind, who had been born blind. Then there is a long discourse about seeing and not seeing, being blind, the light, and so on. So what John is doing is something very, very different from the synoptics.
Okay. Let's move on here. Here comes another favorite question of mine, because it has to do with this guy. What first perspectives do you present on the Son of Man debate? And what are the implications that Jesus is portrayed as the anointed one?
Wow. Well, we could go on.
I know, like
talking
forever.
about this, and these are the huge questions, of course. It's really going into what sometimes has been called the self-understanding of Jesus, self-perception.
Yes.
Did he think of himself as the Messiah or not? And since the early 20th century, there has been a huge debate on this, because that's when scholars really started doubting that Jesus himself claimed to be the Messiah. And this is a very difficult question, because the Messiah, the concept of the Messiah as we know it, is very much formed by the Gospels. There were very different ideas in early Judaism about the Messiah or the Messiahs, sometimes more than one anointed figures that would come in the end time. So it's a very tricky area. I think the perspective we bring in our book is, and this is in keeping with our ambition to work as careful historians, is not to presuppose that Jesus himself did have a very clear and fixed idea of his identity, but rather that he, just as I think most or all of us, was struggling with this, maybe throughout his life, thinking about his purpose in life and his identity. And I mean, being a Messiah or the Messiah is not something that you would lightly lay claim to. It would probably be something that you, even if you had this idea, you would be searching and discussing with others. Could it be the case? And we have these scenes in the Gospels where Jesus actually asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am? And who do you think that I am?" Maybe that's originally part of a discussion he had with his closest associates. Could it be that I am the Messiah? So we, whether it's the anointed one, the Messiah, or the Son of Man, which we can talk more about that expression, I think we, as historians, we shouldn't presume from the beginning that Jesus had himself a very clear idea of whether he fit these figures or descriptions.
Dr. Wassén, what can you tell us about this debate?
We come to the conclusion that he did call himself the Son of Man, but in different contexts. You know, we have strands of traditions where he talk about being the Son of Man in a very humble sense, as being a human, which is what it means, and also the elevated Son of Man who's coming on the clouds, which is inspired of the description of the Son of Man in Daniel's vision, in the book of Daniel, chapter 7. So it is quite likely that Jesus, you know, he heard these stories and he understood his own role in light of these prophecies, and particularly from the book of Daniel, which seems, which we can see in his sermons, his preaching. And I think this is different perspective than we're used to. As Tobias was saying, that the common view is that he knew he was the Son of God, sort of, or that he was the Messiah. And, well, perhaps it was a development, and of course he would have been helped by the scriptures.
Yeah.
So he interpreted the scriptures in oral form as well.
Look at that.
And probably saw himself a future elevated position when God would redeem him, elevate him to be a royally kind of son of man, or how you put it.
Yeah. I don't know, Marv, if you have had Richard Bauckham on this show.
Oh, I was thinking of him. Trust me,
yeah.
His most recent book on the Son of Man. Yeah.
Yeah, you should. I think he's working on the second volume of that very interesting work on the Son of Man. And the first volume is the most thorough investigation of the development of this. He wouldn't call it a title, but it's an expression, let's say. And of course, it has something to do with the book of Daniel. And then we have some very early reception of the book of Daniel in texts such as First Enoch, Fourth Ezra. And what all these early receptions seem to converge in is that they somehow understand this Son of Man figure in the book of Daniel as a messianic figure. So the Son of Man isn't something or someone different from the Messiah, but is interpreted as the Messiah. So it's quite likely that, and I mean, there are several arguments that Jesus did use this phrase, Son of Man. We find it, I think, just about 50 or 60 times in the Gospels. It's always on the lips of Jesus. It's just himself that seems to speak of himself as Son of Man. And what people would have heard is probably something like the Messiah or an anointed figure. So it is a very important concept, probably, in Jesus' preaching. But as we have tried to emphasize, we shouldn't be too sure that Jesus knew from the beginning that he was to be identified with this Son of Man. It could be a role that he slowly accepted and grew into.
And
great.
An interesting argument in favor of that Jesus talked about himself in terms of Son of Man is that we don't have evidence of the early church using this term about Jesus. So where did it come from? Well, perhaps from Jesus.
Yeah.
To be honest with you both, I didn't know that. I thought they used it. Okay. I like this topic very much. I'm very fond of this. All that has to do with watchers, angels, gods. I'm all into it. So let's go to the final, last but not least question, guys. Again, thank you for being here. And I'm gonna put it right there on your screen. So it says, last but not least, chapter 11 is about the first Christian believers and how it evolved from a minor Jewish messianic apocalyptic sect to a and I'm quoting this from your book, to a multi-ethnic movement in the Roman Empire. Please give us some takeaways from the last section of this book.
Yeah, well, we would like to know more about this development, but clearly this early Jewish movement was more successful outside of the land than in the land. But there are so many different parts to this period in history. But thanks to the book of Acts of the Apostles, we know something about this early Jewish movement in the land. So they are in Jerusalem and they stay in Jerusalem after Jesus' death. So, and why did they move in some cases to Jerusalem? Well, probably because they expected him to come back very soon to Jerusalem. And what's interesting is that part of his family is there. Perhaps they had relatives there, who knows? But James, his brother, becomes the leader in this early movement, which is a great surprise, because we don't hear about him in the gospel, except that Jesus had a bit of a conflict with his family, and then he's all of a sudden the next leader. So, and I would love to know what kind of view of Jesus did he have?
Yeah.
As a Messiah. He was obviously believing that Jesus was the Messiah, but in what sense? They had grown up together. But anyway, we don't know. But
potato right there.
But we hear about this missionary movement, and they are very zealous. And we learn a lot about Paul, and of course through his letters, and also in Acts. So it's a missionary movement. It's urgent, and they are really, time is short. When Paul is very clear about that he expects Jesus to come back within his lifetime. So there's no point in getting married and things like that. We have to focus on what's important. And they're very successful outside of the land. And there is this very interesting meeting that we hear of both in the Acts in chapter 15 and in Paul's letter to the Galatians about a meeting in Jerusalem. And the big question is, what do we do with the non-Jews, with the Gentiles, with the ex-pagans, to use Paula Fredrikson's terminology?
Paula Fredriksson,
Ex-pagans, Christ followers. What do we do with them? Do they have to circumcise? That is, do they have to convert to Judaism, become Jewish? Because it's a Jewish movement. And that would also mean that they would live Jewishly more fully. That is, keeping the Sabbath, keeping this dietary restrictions, and those distinct customs that were peculiar for the Jews. If they were going to join the Jews as an ethnic group. And is that what the new Christ believers, the Gentiles, have to do? And they come to the conclusion that they don't need to do that, but they still have to live quite Jewishly. They have to refrain from pagan cults, from worship of several gods, and become quite Jewish, but not those spiritual laws. So it's the perspective is important here, that what should we do with the non-Jews that are converting to our new movement, Christ following movement? So it's very much a Jewish movement. And then, of course, as more Gentiles enter the movement, it becomes something very different, a very different movement. And then with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, the Jewish center of this movement is destroyed. So that, but it becomes very successful in the diaspora, first through the synagogues, and then spreading very successfully. So,
it's like that saying in the Bible that no prophet can be honored somewhere else, not in his own town. So, Dr. Hägerland.
Because it's sort of difficult to reconcile that the Jewish Messiah was not really accepted as such in his home country.
Yeah, you can of course still see the centrality of Jerusalem in the letters of Paul, not least the collection that it's mentioned in, and it's a thing that you maybe, if you are not a specialist, you wouldn't notice this, but it's mentioned in several places in the letters of Paul that he's taking out this collection from what he thinks of as his churches, his congregations he founded, but he's taken this collection to bring to the church at Jerusalem. And he presents this as part of the deal that he had with some of Jesus' original disciples, to think about the poor ones in Jerusalem. So and that seems to have carried quite a strong symbolic significance for Paul, connecting his churches or congregations to the mother congregation in Jerusalem, as it were. But then, as Cecilia mentioned, then Jerusalem is destroyed, so it fades away. Nevertheless, still into the 2nd century, we find some traces of a more Jewish Christianity, if that's the correct term for it even, but Jesus-focused Judaism still lingering around in the Mediterranean area on the one hand, and on the other hand we have developing what becomes and what we usually call Gnosticism, and I think you can say that Christian Gnosticism or Gnostic Christianity is a variety of Christianity that becomes very distanced from everything Jewish. So you have these different varieties of Christianity, and it's really sometime in the 4th century that it begins consolidating. And from then on, we have this idea of mainstream Christianity. And that's, of course, very much a retrojection of what came after the 4th century even, thinking back in terms of a straight line of the middle road between Judaism and Gnosticism. There you have it, Orthodox, Catholic, mainstream Christianity. But as you said, I think, Marv, I don't know if it was before the show began, but you said that history is messy. And this was a really messy thing.
It was in the show. Yeah. It's not my quote. It belongs to this scholar. But you agree. I mean, you as a historian, you agree that history is messy and complex. Yeah.
Indeed.
Okay, guys. Any final comments? And also, I need to ask you, what do you have in the pipeline? Any future projects that we should be aware of? Hit us with that. Any book that you have there? Any recent project? And as you speak, I want to show you something here, how I got to know about Dr. Hägerland here. This is your, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is your dissertation? I don't know if you can see it there.
I
Dr.
can just
Hägerland?
see the Son of Man debate. That's
No. That's not the one.
That's not my book.
No.
There is a book for that, but it's a great book, but probably, I'm sorry, it's not my book. So,
Is this one?
Yeah,
that's yours, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's correct.
This is for my audience, so that you can go there on Amazon and get your own copy.
Yes, that's a very good suggestion. Well, I have written a few things about the historical Jesus, edited volumes, and so on, but I'm mainly into something quite different nowadays. I work on the pastoral epistles. So it's on the other side of the New Testament spectrum, you could say. If the historical Jesus is where everything began, the pastoral epistles, which I happily date well into the 2nd century, they are towards the end of the textual production of the early Christians. So I'm working on that. So you could look for some publications coming up.
Dr. Wassén, she has also published a lot of articles on purity, holiness, on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Also, there's a book there on the Dead Sea Scrolls and media culture, if I'm not wrong. Correct me if I'm correct on that.
I'm the editor there.
Yeah.
No, sorry, I'm not. I'm just. I contributed with an article, but I've edited quite a few volumes on the Dead Sea Scrolls. But as Tobias mentioned, we're part of the same project working on apocalyptic thought. It's an interdisciplinary project. So my part there still focuses on Jesus' teaching in the Jewish context, working with these many of the Jewish texts that never made it into the canon. And the scrolls, I'm fascinated by those, and those are really a window into the diverse views of this time period. I think when the scrolls were discovered, people were surprised to see how many different ideas, for example, about the Messiah was around. But anyway, I am working on Jesus as a teacher of law, halakha, and as a teacher and as an apocalyptic teacher, and how does this work together, sort of in his message, among other things. And I'm also working on a commentary on the Damascus document in the Hermetic
sweet
series, together with Sidney White Crawford. So
Thank you. You're good friends with Dr. Charlotte Hempel from Birmingham University, right? Well, a bunch of them, John J. Collins and many others. So, guys, I have fun. I love this. I love these conversations. Dr. Wassén was asking me if I had some degree. No, I haven't, but I love these conversations. I love the scholarship books. We are bookish people. We are bookish people. But more than that, I love hearing from the authors themselves, talking about what they write, this stuff. And personally, I always try to say this to my interviewees. When I was in college, I had a nightmares with writing a 5 pages essay. So imagine how terrible was I. So that's why I admire people like you who go on and write, maybe 300 pages, 200 pages book. That's not my thing. That's outside of my wheelhouse. So this is a good way, as I was saying again, because we want to bring all this good material, all this good content to anyone who has a very keen interest in this type of things. There are a lot of people with hunger out there. They want to know about this, and we want to help those to find this material and make their own way and work their way out into this, because it's complicated. Scholarship is complicated. It's very difficult to read a lot of literature. But you guys coming here to this interview and just giving you in a very basic introductory level is a good thing, that everybody could pay attention to this interview and have some, like, a peek of what's behind this book. It's very affordable. So I have put the link down here in the notes so people can click on it and they can get their own copy and have fun reading through it. So again, thank you. I don't know if you have any last comments before we go.
Thank you very much, Mar, for posing such intelligent and good and initiated questions, and for conducting this discussion with such
thank you
passion, and for bringing our scholarship to the Spanish-speaking world, because that's a huge part of the world which I personally can't write in or even speak Spanish, but I'm very glad that you're bringing it to people who prefer to take part of it in Spanish. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Wassén?
Yeah, Tobias put it very nicely. I agree with everything he said, and I also want to thank you very much for inviting us. And I've enjoyed the discussion, and it's been my pleasure.
Thank you. Final question. Are you guys on Facebook?
Yes.
You are? Okay, you will have my Facebook request, because I'm going to be sharing this through my social media platforms. So you can either share it or just post it, whatever you like. So with that in mind, people, I just want to thank our audience for their comments, questions, everything. Please pay attention to our future interviews. We have pretty top-notch scholarship coming here. This Saturday, the one and only Florentino Garcia Martinez, he's coming to the show to talk about Dead Sea Scrolls. And just a couple hours later, I will have a conversation with Professor Lawrence Schiffman, another great Dead Sea scholars. So please keep an eye on that, and we'll see you until the next time. Bye now.
Bye.
Here.